Hey guys, welcome back for a little more remote learning here. We're shifting gears, moving on from our mammals unit and starting up our amphibians and reptiles unit today. We're going to start out right off the bat with Maine's amphibians, and for the next couple classes here before April break, we're really going to focus in on some cool stuff happening in the Maine woods right now with our amphibians, that being vernal pools, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But before we do, we should talk real quick about what makes an amphibian an amphibian. When we use that term amphibians, we're talking about creatures that are ectothermic poikilotherms. And I love that stuff. When we go back and think about our vocab from that mammals unit, we know to be ectothermic means that you get your body warmth from outside. Ectotherm is outside warmth. And poikilotherms are creatures whose body temperature is constantly changing based on the environment, right? A homeotherm, a mammal, can regulate one steady body temperature. We humans are pretty good at that. But amphibians get their body warmth from the environment, and they use the environment to regulate that warmth. Meaning, if they want to warm up, they need to find a nice warm sunny spot. If they want to cool down, they need to find a cool shady spot or go underground or underwater. So the layman's term there would be that amphibians are cold-blooded, but we wildlife biologists would say that amphibians are ectothermic poikilotherms. We know they're oviparous, which means they lay eggs, and most amphibians actually require water for eggs because part of their life cycle often includes water. Not always, but most require water for part of their life cycle, and we're talking about we all think about frog, tadpoles, and many salamanders as well require water, and we're going to learn about that here as we go. Amphibians have smooth, moist skin that's really permeable to air and water. Most of them are able to drink through their skin and breathe through their skin. Many of them can absorb oxygen underwater through their skin in small amounts, and most have gills as larvae and then lungs as adults, so they'll develop the ability to breathe air as adults. And they have a three-chambered heart, a little more advanced than that two-chambered heart of fish, but not quite as advanced as our four-chambered heart with our birds and mammals. So just some neat stuff. That's what makes an amphibian an amphibian. So kind of cool. And in Maine, we have two of the three major groups of amphibians. We have frogs, which are Anura. We'll talk about that, the order Anura, here in a little bit. And we have salamanders, members of the order Caudata. What we don't have is this third really obscure group of amphibians called caecilians that look an awful lot like an earthworm. If we look up these, let's see if I can even remember how to spell that. Let's see if I looked up the right thing. There we go. These are caecilians, and these things are crazy looking. They're actually amphibians. They satisfy all those parts of being an amphibian. They look a little bit like a cross between a snake and an earthworm, but none of those in Maine. But other parts of the world, there is a third kind of group of amphibians out there. Just wanted you guys to know that. Here in Maine, we just have frogs and salamanders for those two groups of caecilians. But let's talk real quick about vernal pools, because today and the next day, next class before break are going to be kind of heavily centered on vernal pools. Some of my favorite topics. Man, do I love vernal pools. They are a neat way to study wildlife. So vernal pools are critical habitat for amphibian reproduction. These are seasonal bodies of water in the Maine woods. They're not permanent ponds. They're ponds that fill with snowmelt in the spring. Amphibians come in and they use those ponds to reproduce. And then by the end of the summer, those ponds are going to dry up. And that makes them seasonal. Vernal meaning spring, right? So vernal pools are spring pools, essentially. To be considered a vernal pool, there are three requirements that have to be met. Number one, it has to be seasonal. It has to dry up. And we have some vernal pools that might dry up every couple of years, but at some point they should dry up. On a dry summer, that thing should dry up. It can't be a permanent body of water. There cannot be fish present, and that's almost always the case with a vernal pool. If it's going to dry up, then we're not going to have fish that are able to be present in a seasonal pond. And the fact that there's no fish is really important because it allows for enhanced reproduction of these amphibians, some frogs and salamanders, that are really susceptible to being preyed upon by fish at their larval stage. So the last requirement there is that we need to have indicator species present reproducing here. There's three kind of major indicator species we look for in the Maine woods. Number one is wood frogs. If we can have wood frogs reproducing in a body of water, it is likely a vernal pool, although they will reproduce in some kind of permanent bodies of water, but vernal pools are really their preferred reproductive site. Spotted salamanders, both blue and yellow, which we'll talk about eventually, rely almost exclusively on vernal pools for reproduction. And then we have these really cool little creatures that we won't spend a ton of time on in this class, but fairy shrimp, which if we look up here, we can look up a picture of a fairy shrimp real quick. These, I call them the sea monkeys of the Maine woods. These are tiny little crustaceans that live in vernal pools. There you go. There's your fairy shrimp right there. These little guys live in vernal pools, and they lay eggs all over the bottom of the pool. When that pool dries up, the adult fairy shrimp die, but their eggs dry and remain in the leaf litter. The next year, when that pool fills with water, those eggs rehydrate, snap back to life, hatch quickly into fairy shrimp, which carry out the life cycle again. So they're like these really uniquely adapted crustaceans to seasonal bodies of water. We find their relatives in deserts and these little temporary ponds that form in deserts after rainfall and all over the world. But here in Maine, we have our own little example of these fairy shrimp in the woods using our vernal pools, and they are a classic example of a vernal pool indicator species as well, because their life cycle requires that pond to be seasonal. So there you have it. Vernal pools are these seasonal bodies of water, vernal meaning spring. They fill up with snowmelt. There's no fish present, and there must be some indicator species breeding there, things like wood frogs, spotted salamanders, and fairy shrimp. So we'll focus more on vernal pools today. A little later on, your assignment is going to be to pick one of these species, do a little bit of research on it, and figure out answer some questions about it based upon your research. That's a vernal pool indicator species profile assignment for today. Briefly though, let's look at the different orders of amphibians we have here in Maine, and after break we'll look more deeply at this and we'll learn how to identify them. So we have the order Anura, those are frogs and toads. These guys have a head that's fused to their body. They lack a tail for the most part. They use external fertilization like fish, and males vocalize to attract a mate. I believe we have 10 species of frogs here in Maine. We're going to learn 9 of them, and those guys, we're going to learn all of their calls as well. So you'll know 9 of our 10 species of frog here in Maine by sight and sound when we're done after break. And there you go. There's your list of frogs we have here in Maine, or 9 species, I'm sorry. And 8 of them are common in southern Maine, so those are the ones that we'll focus on, and we'll talk more about that after break. The order Caudata, those are our salamanders, caudal meaning tail. These are amphibians with a tail. They have 4 small limbs, an obvious tail. Some live their entire lives on land, like that northern redback salamander you see right there. And then some use internal fertilization, being a little bit different there than frogs. And we have 9 species of salamanders here in Maine, but we're really going to focus on those 4 top salamanders. Those are the ones that are commonly observed here in southern Maine. The other ones are out there, but just not quite as common to find. So I've often had kids say, hey, I found a lizard under a log in my yard, and I'll often correct them and say, actually, there's no lizards in Maine. We have no native lizards, but we do have our salamanders. Remember, lizards are reptiles, which we'll talk about after break. Salamanders being amphibians, right? So there you have it. Go ahead and get to work on that Maine vernal pool indicator species assignment posted under today's topic. Pick one of those indicator species, whether it be wood frog, spotted salamander, either blue or yellow spotted, or the fairy shrimp. Do a little bit of research and answer those questions, and we'll be